Dewey's philosophy. They respected each other as philosophers, but Bertrand Russell hated Dewey's philosophy. He also thought pragmatism was all about might makes truth. He called it battleship philosophy. Like think about, I think it was Commodore Perry sailed the Great White Fleet, the American battleships into Japan, long ago, and then Japan said, okay, we'll open our ports, because they had to. So this is Bertrand Russell's view of pragmatism, might makes truth. Now, Dewey hated this. Dewey hated this kind of caricature of his philosophy. In China, Dewey and Bertrand Russell were both lecturing at the same time to thousands of Chinese about 1920. And Dewey so hated kind of Russell's treatment of his philosophy. Dewey wouldn't come into the lecture hall and listen to his American colleague or his British philosopher colleague give a lecture. But Dewey was also interested in what Russell said. So Dewey supposedly stood outside the door and listened secretly to what Russell was saying while he was lecturing to Chinese. So there's an interesting relationship between Dewey and Russell. And it's interesting that a student of Dewey takes on this battle. So if you remember that piece, the review of Bertrand Russell's book, what does Ambedkar talk about? Ambedkar talks about Russell's book being very useful about the reconstruction of society, but he also talks about, you can't be a pacifist, you can't be a quietist. Bertrand Russell was a renowned pacifist. He later in his life he went to jail because of protest and war resistance efforts. So Dewey Ambedkar kind of thought, there's this kind of quietism in India that I've got to watch out, because if Indians read this, think what happens with Satyagraha and Dewey and Gandhi's kind of way of protest. There's kind of a quietism that might come about. So in this review, you see Ambedkar telling explicitly Indian audiences not to become too enamored with pacifism, because you need some kind of force to get things done. And so there, in 1918, in this book review, you see the first published, in print, reference of Ambedkar to his teacher Dewey. And he refers to force as energy, force as violence. Where does this come from? Dewey's written some articles on force and violence, but they don't exactly map onto this. What does map directly onto that way of talking about it, force as violence, force as energy? The 1916 April lecture Dewey gave, where he talks about these things. So Baba Sahib, like a good student, was paying attention in class, and then he starts to apply these in new ways. That distinction, by the way, will never leave him. In 1950s, Baba Sahib writes, an unpublished piece called The Buddha or Karl Marx. And if you pay attention there, he explicitly says, as Professor Dewey said, forces energy, forces violence. So that same distinction was so valuable, even though he evolves way beyond whatever Dewey said, he still thinks that distinction is useful enough to use even late in his life when he's trying to reconcile or compare Buddhism to Marxist communism. So, he's worried through all these things, right, about how to get things done, but how not to become an oppressor just like the people that oppressed you. That's one of the worries in Bertrand Russell's book. That's one of the worries young Bimrao Ambedkar has in 1918. How do you not just give up, but how do you do something, reform society without becoming as oppressive and destroying other people's ends and destroying fraternity with them? Okay? We often forget about that, right? The focus, in many cases, among Ambedkarites in India is always equality. They're building a statue of equality right in Mumbai. And this is wonderful. You need equality. Equality is key. But never forget, especially later in his life, Ambedkar says more and more fraternity is key. I think this is the secret to Ambedkar. How do we get equality and liberty, freedom, without sacrificing the common bonds that make us a community? Right? He says Buddhism, Marxism, you can get equality by using a lot of guns and bayonets, but you can't force people to like you. So this is kind of the mystery of his later thought, and I'll talk more about this in my route lectures. But Buddhism becomes the way he thinks of trying to get fraternity. That's radically different from the Marxist approach to this. And again, what kind of pushes him down this path? It's Dewey. Dewey was a socialist. Dewey was not enamored by communist Marxist methods that oftentimes would force people to do the right thing. Okay? So this is very much in line with Dewey's notion of social democracy. So let's look at the last one, and this is the final thing I want to trace. So he gets ideas from Dewey's books. He gets ideas from Dewey's classes, but he also gets a general method from Dewey. Now, if you remember right, in Annihilation of Caste, this is probably something everyone here in Nagpur memorizes, at least Buddhists. This is probably the best known work of Baba Sahib, Annihilation of Caste, the Undelivered Speech in 1936. This is again one of the spots where Ambedkar explicitly refers to his Professor Dewey, to who he owes so much, he says. And then he quotes Dewey. Now, beyond those two quotations, there's probably another 700 words in that essay that I've proven are exact. They're echoes from Democracy in Education. There's a lot of echoes from Democracy in Education. There's a few echoes from Ethics, the 1908 edition. And there's even one echo from Dewey's 1925 book, Experience in Nature. That's a book that Ambedkar also owned, and it's at Start College with his underlinings in it. So there's a lot in Annihilation of Caste that isn't even attributed to John Dewey that is an inspiration of Dewey. So he says, though, in the quotations, Professor Dewey, who was my teacher and whom I owe so much, has said, quote, every society gets encumbered with what is trivial with dead wood from the past, with what is positively perverse, ... As society becomes more enlightened, it realizes that it is responsible not to conserve and transmit the whole of its existing achievements, but only such that make for a better society. So the idea is that, and this is what I've tried to work out in some of my publications. Look at what's in that ... If you look at what's in the original Dewey quote, what Ambedkar cuts out is Dewey's sentences, there's about 2 or 3, on how the schools are responsible for selectively taking things from the past tradition such that they create citizens and a better future. So this is fascinating, right? The quotation is about reconstructing the past. What does Ambedkar do with the quotation itself? He reconstructs it. So this is, I think, an incredibly important part for understanding what he does with Buddhism in the 50s and why some Buddhists don't like it, right? They say, this is not the Buddha and his Dhamma, it's Ambedkar and his Dhamma. So some people really are opposed to his view of Buddhism. Why? Because he's putting stuff together, leaving stuff out, changing parts. Well, look back in 1936, he's very honest about his method. He takes out the schools because caste cannot be solved by schools, where Brahmin students couldn't touch, you wouldn't want to be touched by Dalits, let's say, or different schools for different castes. So schools would not solve the problems in India like they might solve in America. Okay? So instead, Ambedkar says we need to reconstruct a variety of things in a variety of ways dealing with Indian tradition. So you see here what I call his reconstructive method. So some people, like my friend Chris Queen, says, Ambedkar's Buddhism is postmodern. And there's a truth to that. He's putting stuff together, leaving stuff out. But I think it's much more straightforward to say his form of Buddhism is pragmatist. Why? Because it's reconstructive. And why is this pragmatist? Look at what he says about Dewey. Society does not have to transmit the past just as it is to the future. It can select. And the Buddha in the future of his religion, right? Ambedkar says the Buddha gave license to his disciples to chip and chop at his thought. So it's all over Ambedkar if you but pay attention to it. What he saw in Dewey was a method of reconstructing society. And what he sees when it comes to Buddhism is a tradition that says, please reconstruct what the Buddha was saying to be useful for you. So I'll leave you with one overlooked example in Annihilation of Caste. Like I said, there are many things in Annihilation of Caste that are echoed from Democracy in Education. But there's some, for instance, in the reply to the Mahatma he appends to the second edition starting in 1937. You might remember this line. He says the Mahatma, Gandhi, right, not Phule, appears not to believe in thinking. He prefers to follow the saints. Like a conservative with his reverence for sacred notions, he is afraid that if he once starts thinking, many ideals and institutions to which he clings will be doomed. One must sympathize with him. For every act of independent thinking puts some portion of the apparently stable world in peril. If you look at Experience in Nature, that's Dewey's book, right? You see Dewey say something very similar, right? And there's enough phrases in here that's non-chance. Ambedkar had to have this thought in his mind when he wrote. So Dewey says, these are Dewey's words, again, not talking about Gandhi, not talking about religious conservatives, he's talking about philosophical people who said, the truth is already out there, and let's just come up with a theory. Dewey said, let us admit the case of the conservative. If we once start thinking, no one can guarantee where we shall come out, except that many objects, ends, and institutions are surely doomed. Every thinker puts some portion of an apparently stable world in peril once they start thinking. So, this is kind of one of those examples of how Ambedkar sees an idea or a concept in Dewey, and then he uses a method that's kind of all over the pragmatist. You don't have to just take theories as they come to you. You don't have to take the world as it comes to you. And you don't have to take Dewey as it comes to you. And you can reconstruct this for your own purposes. What were Baba Sahib's purposes? To strike a blow against caste oppression, of course. In the 1950s, what were his purposes? To do this by reconstructing Buddhism, to be a very pragmatist, life-affirming faith, a philosophy. Okay, so I'll leave you with this notion. I encourage you to study Dewey. I obviously encourage you to study Bhimrao Ambedkar. And I encourage you to study how their philosophies are similar and how things change once India comes into the picture. And I really sincerely believe that we cannot understand Baba Sahib Ambedkar unless we understand Dewey's pragmatism. And as I tell all my friends in America, you can't really understand the weaknesses, strengths, and potentials of Dewey's pragmatism, all 8 million words of it, unless you see what Baba Sahib Ambedkar has done here in India with concepts of caste and also with religious outlooks like Buddhism. Thank you for your attention.